The morning sun didn't so much rise as it bled over the jagged peaks of the Wind River Range. It cast long, skeletal shadows across a landscape carved from granite and hardship. For 3 years, this place had been Eli McCall's world. 3 years since he'd walked out of civilization and let the wilderness carve away the man he used to be. What was left was something harder, something that belonged to the pines and the wolves. His cabin was a testament to that hardness. Timber he'd felled himself, chinked with mud and moss. It wasn't much, but it was solid. It was his. He stepped onto the porch, a tin cup of coffee steaming in his hand. At 42, Eli moved with a quiet economy. A man who'd learned that every calorie burned was a calorie you had to find again. He was lean, corded with the kind of muscle you only get from wrestling a life out of a land that wants to kill you. The morning ritual never changed. Check the snares, tend the garden, split the wood, mend what was broken. And in this country, something was always broken. He pulled on his boots, the leather scarred with 3 years of rocky trails and creek crossings. He turned the key in the hand-forged lock on his door, a lock he'd hammered out of scrap iron during a winter so long and so quiet, the silence itself felt like it had weight. He walked the path to the creek, his lightning-twisted walking stick tapping a lonely rhythm against the stones. He knelt and drank from the icy water. It tasted of stone and sky. This was his church. This was his peace. His snare held a fat rabbit. Good. That was meat for a few days. He reset the trap with the thoughtless efficiency of a man whose survival depended on it. He could read the weather in the sky, predict a storm in the ache of his bones. He had paid for this knowledge with loneliness, but it was his. Walking back, he paused by his small garden. The potatoes were ready, root vegetables that would last the winter. It wasn't a life of comfort, but it was a life. It was enough, or so he told himself. Inside the cabin, he started on breakfast. Coffee beans ground by hand, bacon sizzling in a cast iron pan. Simple tasks to anchor him to the present, to keep his mind from wandering down old dark trails. But as he reached for the tin of coffee, his fingers brushed against a small wooden box tucked away behind a flour sack. His hand jerked back like he'd been burned. It was too late. The memories were already stirring. The cabin suddenly felt smaller. The walls seemed to press in, and he could almost hear her voice. Eli, come look at this sunset. Have you ever seen anything so beautiful? Sarah. Her name was a ghost on his tongue. 3 years of silence, and she could still ambush him in his own home. He poured his coffee, his hands shaking just enough for him to notice. It was bitter and black. The way he drank it now. She used to take hers with honey and cream. Sometimes a man needs to taste the bitter, he'd told her, to appreciate the sweet. Now there was only bitter. Inside that box was a photograph. Sarah in her Sunday best, a blue dress with little flowers that matched her eyes, smiling into a prairie wind. He'd taken it the day after he asked her father for her hand. That future had lasted exactly 11 months and 3 days. Then the fever came. It took her, and it took the child she was carrying. When it was over, he sold everything, took his rifle and his grief, and walked west until the world ran out. He'd come here to bury his ghosts, but standing in his silent cabin with winter coming on, he had to wonder if he'd only given them a place to haunt. The barometric glass on his mantelpiece had been dropping for 2 days straight, the mercury falling like a stone. He'd traded a month's worth of beaver pelts for it, and it had never lied to him yet. In this country, the weather could kill you faster than a bullet. The air felt heavy, charged. The forest had gone silent, holding its breath. Clouds were massing on the western peaks, a gray army preparing to march. It was early November, but the sky was promising the kind of storm that buried men and their dreams. Eli spent the morning in a controlled frenzy. He split and stacked wood until the pile reached the eaves of the cabin. He filled the water barrels and checked the root cellar. He cleaned his rifle and counted his ammunition. Not that he expected human trouble. This valley was a secret he kept with the mountains. But a blizzard could make desperate animals do desperate things. A hungry wolf pack, a starving mountain lion. They were as dangerous as any man with a gun. By afternoon, the first fat snowflakes began to drift down. They melted on the ground, but he knew it wouldn't last. The temperature was plunging. This wasn't a dusting. This was a blizzard. The kind that could trap a man for weeks, that could turn the world outside his window into a blank white page. He brought in enough firewood to last a week, maybe more if he was careful. The thought of being snowed in didn't bother him. Solitude was an old friend. As darkness fell, the wind began to howl. Snow lashed against the single window, hissing like sand. He settled into his chair with a book, the words familiar, comforting. Outside, the storm raged. The wind screamed. He heard the crack of a heavy branch giving way under the weight of the snow. This was the wilderness in its purest form, beautiful, terrible, and completely indifferent. It was just another test. He had no way of knowing that this storm was bringing something else, that before the sun rose again, a stranger would bring a different kind of storm right to his door. The sound came after midnight, a faint thump, thump, thump that was almost lost in the howl of the wind. At first he thought it was a branch, or snow sliding from the roof. But there it was again, rhythmic, urgent. Someone was at his door. Eli put his book down, every nerve suddenly on fire. In 3 years, he'd never had a visitor. Not one. The nearest town was 40 miles of bad country away. Impossible in a storm like this. Whoever was out there had to be either insane or running from something far worse than the blizzard. The pounding came again, weaker this time, desperate. He moved to the window, trying to peer into the swirling chaos. He could just make out a dark shape huddled against the door, a slumped figure at the very edge of collapse. His hand went to the rifle beside the fireplace. Caution was a religion in these mountains. But then another sound cut through the wind, a voice high and thin. "Please, help me." It was a woman's voice, a voice stretched thin with terror and exhaustion. He'd heard that sound before, in the war. It was the sound of someone's world ending. He threw the heavy bar from the door and pulled it open. A blast of wind and snow roared into the cabin, and with it, a figure collapsed across the threshold. It was a woman wrapped in a fine woolen cloak that was now torn and frozen solid. Her dark hair was matted with ice, her face as pale as marble, her lips blue. Her eyes were barely open, but in them he saw a flicker of fierce, stubborn life. She was young, with the delicate features of a woman who had never known a day of hardship. But her face was marred by deep exhaustion and something else. Fear. The kind of fear that gets into your bones. Her clothes were all wrong. A fine traveling dress, the kind a lady would wear on a train, completely useless against a Wyoming blizzard. As he knelt beside her, something caught his eye. A scrap of blue silk ribbon was tangled in her hair. It was expensive, the kind of thing you'd see at a Boston society ball, and it was stained with something dark. Blood. He touched her shoulder. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered, trying to focus. They were gray, like a stormy sky, and sharp with an intelligence that even the cold couldn't dull. "Safe?" she whispered, the word a ghost of a sound. "You're safe," he said, and for the first time in a long time, he was making a promise. He lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. Kicking the door shut against the storm, he carried her to the fire, his mind already racing. Dry clothes, warm blankets, hot food. Whatever she was running from had followed her into the wilderness, and now it was in his house. He worked with the practiced efficiency of a battlefield medic. First, the frozen clothes. He kept his eyes averted, his movements quick and impersonal, but he couldn't miss the signs. Under the ruined dress, her skin was a road map of her ordeal. Bruises, dark and ugly, circled her wrists like bracelets. They were shaped like fingers. Scratches crisscrossed her arms, and on her temple a nasty gash, still sluggishly oozing blood. Someone had hit her, hard, and recently. His medical kit was crude, bandages from old shirts, a salve of pine pitch and herbs, but his hands remembered the work. As he cleaned the cut on her head, she stirred, moaning in her sleep. "Don't. Please don't," she murmured, lost in a nightmare. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and steady, the same voice he used on spooked horses. "You're safe here." His words seemed to reach her. She quieted. He wrapped her in his warmest blankets and set a pot of beef broth on the stove. While it heated, he studied his guest. Her hands told a story. They were soft, with no calluses. Her nails were clean, manicured. These were not the hands of a frontier woman. They were the hands of a lady, a woman of privilege and comfort. The bloody blue ribbon lay on his table. It was fine silk, imported. Something like that cost money, serious money. What was a woman like this doing in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a killer blizzard? She began to stir again, her eyes opening. They darted around the cabin, taking in the rough walls, his weathered face, the rifle propped within easy reach. He could see her mind working, assessing, calculating. Where, where am I? Her voice was a raw whisper. My cabin, he said simply. Wind River Range. You nearly froze to death on my doorstep. She tried to sit up, wincing. How long? A few hours. Storm still raging. He ladled the hot broth into a cup and held it out to her. Drink this. She took the cup, her eyes never leaving his face. He could see the questions in them. Questions he wasn't sure he wanted the answers to. Because whatever brought this woman to his door, it wasn't just bad luck. It was trouble. And it was just getting started. Dawn brought no relief. The storm had only grown stronger, the wind hammering the cabin like an angry fist. Eli woke in his chair by the fire to find his guest awake. She was sitting up on his narrow bed, wrapped in blankets, watching him with those intelligent gray eyes. You stayed up all night, she said. Her voice was stronger, but still fragile. Seemed like the right thing to do, he said, stretching. He saw her tense at the movement, a subtle flinch, like a deer catching a scent on the wind. That knock on your head, wasn't sure how bad it was. She touched the bandage on her temple. You patched me up. Cleaned the cut, got you warm. You were half dead when you got here. In the gray morning light, he could see her more clearly. Her hair, dry now, was the color of rich coffee. Her features were fine, aristocratic. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, even wrapped in his rough blankets. This was a woman used to being in charge, used to being obeyed, not used to collapsing on a stranger's floor. I should thank you, she said, her tone formal. You saved my life. Maybe, he grunted, turning to the stove. He wasn't comfortable with gratitude. Storm's not over yet. She fell silent, but he could feel her gaze on his back as he made coffee. When he turned around, she was looking at a pair of fine leather gloves that must have fallen from her cloak. They were expensive, with tiny pearl buttons at the wrist. You're wondering who I am, she stated. It wasn't a question. More interested in what you're running from, he said, his voice harder than he intended. Don't get many ladies in fine traveling clothes out this way. She looked up, her gaze direct. My name is Clara. Clara Reed. The name meant nothing to him, but the way she said it told him it was supposed to. Boston, he guessed, catching the faint, clipped accent in her speech. Surprise flickered across her face. How did you know? Heard the accent before. He handed her a cup of coffee. Question is, what's a Boston lady doing in Wyoming in the middle of a blizzard? She took the cup, her hands trembling slightly. I was on a stagecoach, traveling west. There was an accident. It was a lie. He could hear it in the careful, measured cadence of her words. He'd heard that same tone from men trying to explain how they'd lost a poker game or why they were deserting their post. It was the sound of a story being built, brick by flimsy brick. Bad country for a stagecoach this time of year, he said, keeping his voice neutral, especially for a woman alone. I wasn't alone, she said quickly, then caught herself. The other passengers, they didn't make it. He could see the lie warring with the truth behind her eyes. He let the silence hang in the air, thick with unspoken questions. He was a man who had craved solitude, and now his cabin was filled with the presence of this woman and her secrets. Well, he said finally, storm's likely to last another day or two. You'll be staying here till it blows over. It wasn't an offer, it was a fact. Outside, the world was a howling vortex of white. Whatever she was running from couldn't get in, but she couldn't get out either. They were trapped, together, and he was starting to think the storm was the least of his problems. The second day of the storm brought a change. Clara, if that was even her name, had regained some of her strength, and with it, a quiet resolve that surprised him. She insisted on helping with the chores, moving around his small cabin with an awkward grace. She was clearly unfamiliar with cooking on a wood stove or washing dishes in a basin, but she was determined. "I'm not used to being idle," she said when he tried to protest, "and I've imposed enough already." There was a core of steel beneath the refined manners. She wasn't as fragile as she looked. As she worked, her sleeve rode up, revealing the bruises on her wrist more clearly. They were older than he'd first thought, a sickening palette of purple and yellow-green. Someone had held her, and held her tight. The sight stirred a protective anger in him, an emotion he hadn't felt in years. He found himself watching her, trying to piece together the puzzle she presented. He noticed her gaze kept drifting to the small shelf of books he kept by the fireplace. "You read," she observed later, her voice soft. "Some," he said, "helps pass the winters." She walked over to the shelf, her fingers ghosting over the worn spines. He had a strange mix: Shakespeare, some philosophy, manuals on farming, and a tattered Bible that had been his mother's. "Milton," she said, pulling out his copy of Paradise Lost. "I wouldn't have expected to find him in the wilderness." "Found it in a burned-out cabin north of here," he said. "Seemed ashamed to let good words go to waste." She opened the book to a page he'd marked. "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven," she read aloud. Then she looked at him, a new curiosity in her eyes. "Is that your philosophy, Mr. McCall?" He froze. He'd never told her his name. He tried to cover his surprise. "I'd say a man makes his own heaven or hell, wherever he is." "A pragmatic view," she said, placing the book back carefully. The mention of her belongings reminded him of the small, oilskin-wrapped bundle he'd found in her cloak. "Your things survived," he said. "They're by the door." A wave of relief washed over her face, making her look younger. "Thank you. I thought I'd lost everything." She unwrapped the bundle with reverence. Inside was a small Bible, a silver locket, and a folded document. A train ticket. She snatched it up and tucked it away before he could get a good look. "Was your grandmother a woman of faith?" he asked, nodding to the Bible she clutched. "The strongest woman I ever knew," she said, her voice warm with memory. "She used to say that sometimes God sends us into the wilderness, not to punish us, but to prepare us." Clara looked around his rough-hewn cabin. "I wonder what she would make of this." "She'd probably say you're right where you need to be," he replied. Their eyes met, and for a long moment the distance between them shrank. He saw not just a frightened woman, but a survivor. And he thought, maybe she saw something more in him than just a hermit hiding from his past. Then the wind shrieked, rattling the door like a hungry animal, and the moment was broken. The storm and the secrets it held captive were still there. By the third day, the blizzard had settled into a grim, monotonous rhythm. The world outside was gone, erased by a relentless curtain of white. Eli looked out the window and could barely see the woodshed 20 feet away. The snow was drifting, piling up against the cabin, burying his world. "How much has fallen?" Clara asked, coming to stand beside him. She'd wrapped herself in one of his spare blankets, looking small and out of place. "3 feet, maybe more," he said. "See that mound? That's my chopping block. It's waist high." The implication was clear. They were well and truly snowed in. This wasn't a storm anymore. It was a siege. His supplies, meant for one man, would now have to stretch for two. He began to ration the food, a cold knot of worry tightening in his gut. Later that morning, he began to fashion a pair of snowshoes from bent branches and leather straps. If the snow didn't let up, he'd have to hunt. "Those are ingenious," Clara said, watching his hands work with a focused intensity. "Necessity," he grunted. "Nearly starved my first winter before I learned how to move in the deep snow." "Your first winter?" she asked, her voice gentle. "So you haven't always lived like this?" It was a careful question, an invitation. He found himself wanting to answer it. "No, came up here 3 years ago. Decided I needed some distance." He kept his answers clipped. "Before that, ranching. Served in the cavalry for a spell." He was building a wall of facts, hiding the real story behind it. She seemed to understand and didn't press. She had walls of her own. That afternoon he went out to clear a path to the well. When he came back inside, stamping the snow from his boots, he found her by the fire, one of his books of poetry open in her lap. "Do you mind?" she asked. "I was hungry for words. Help yourself." She began to read aloud. Her voice was clear and musical, trained, and it filled the small cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He found himself listening, not just to the words, but to her, watching the firelight play across her face, sharing poetry in a blizzard, trapped miles from civilization. It was a strange, unexpected intimacy. When she finished, a new kind of silence settled between them. Not the tense silence of strangers, but something comfortable, companionable. He was a man who had chosen solitude, but for the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel alone. And that scared him more than the storm. The fourth morning dawned with a blinding, profound silence. The storm had broken. Sunlight streamed through the window, glittering on a world transformed, sculpted into alien shapes of pure white. Clara was already awake, writing in a small leather-bound journal. "Good morning," she said, not looking up. "The storm has passed." "Seems so," he said, moving to the window. The drifts were nearly to the roof in some places. "We'll be digging out for a while." She closed the journal, holding it to her chest. "My grandmother said writing things down helps you understand what's in your heart." She smiled, a sad, fond smile. "She would have liked you. She always said the measure of a man is how he treats those who can offer him nothing in return." The words made him uncomfortable. He hadn't helped her for a reward. He'd done it because, well, because it was the right thing to do. "I should check the snares," he said, changing the subject. "May I come with you?" she asked. The request surprised him. "It's rough going out there." "I need to feel the sun," she said, and there was an edge to her voice he hadn't heard before. "I've been in a cage before, Mr. McCall. I know the danger of letting walls get too familiar." He saw the determination in her eyes and nodded. He fashioned a crude pair of snowshoes for her, and an hour later they were moving across the new silent world. She was surprisingly steady on the snowshoes, her grit making up for her inexperience. "It's beautiful," she breathed, her cheeks flushed from the cold and effort. "So, honest. Things are what they appear to be out here," he agreed, "most of the time." They found a rabbit in the fourth snare. As he reset it, she watched him, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What made you stay?" she asked suddenly. "Why learn all this instead of just going back?" The question hit him square in the chest. "Sometimes," he said, the words coming out rough, "a man needs to prove he's worth more than his worst mistakes." She nodded slowly, her gaze knowing. "I know something about mistakes," she said softly, "and the distance a person will travel to escape them." They walked back in a comfortable quiet, a silent understanding passing between them. They were two people on the run, one from grief, one from something else. That night, as they ate rabbit stew by the fire, he found himself thinking about the journal she kept, wondering what secrets she wrote on its pages. He had let his guard down, let this stranger into his carefully constructed world. He didn't know who she was or what she was running from, but he knew one thing: he didn't want her to leave. The fifth evening, the confessions came. They had spent the day working side by side, clearing snow from the roof, digging a path to the woodshed. The shared labor had forged a simple, easy intimacy between them. Now by the fire, he was carving a piece of pine, the shavings falling at his feet. The shape of a small horse was beginning to emerge. "You're very skilled," Clara observed. "Helps pass the time," he said. "Used to make toys for—" The words died in his throat. "For whom?" she asked gently. He looked into the flames and saw another life. "I had a wife once," he said, the words tasting like rust. "Sarah, she was carrying our first child. The fever took them both." Clara's needle stilled in her lap. "I'm so sorry, Eli." It was the first time she had used his name. "That kind of loss, it changes a man." "It empties him out," he corrected. "She saw something in me I never saw in myself. Thought I'd make a decent husband, a good father." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Foolish woman." "Perhaps she wasn't foolish at all," Clara said, her voice soft but firm. "Perhaps she saw the man you are right now." Her words were a balm on a wound he thought would never heal. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just a refugee, but a woman of incredible strength and perception. "What about you?" he asked, needing to shift the focus. "Family in Boston, waiting for you?" Her face shuddered. "Family, yes. Waiting? Perhaps not." She took a deep breath. "I was supposed to marry a man chosen by my father. It wasn't a marriage, it was a business merger." "An arranged marriage?" The idea seemed ancient to him. "Oh, they called it a courtship," she said, her voice laced with acid. "But when my feelings didn't align with my father's business interests, my consent became optional." He thought of the bruises on her wrists, the fear in her eyes. "So you ran." "I fled," she corrected, shame and defiance warring in her expression. "Like a coward." "Doesn't sound cowardly to me," he said, picking up the small wooden horse. "Sounds like a woman who valued her freedom more than their expectations. It takes courage to walk away from everything you know." She looked at him, her gray eyes searching his face. "You speak as if you know." "Different reasons, same journey," he said. "Sometimes the only way forward is to burn the past to the ground and start over." In the quiet of the cabin, surrounded by the vast snowy wilderness, two souls who had tried to lose themselves found instead a reflection in each other. The sixth day, the mountains gave them a gift. A warm wind, a chinook, swept down from the peaks, and the world began to melt. The air filled with the sound of dripping water. Eli found Clara on the porch, her face turned up to the sun like a flower. "It feels like a miracle," she said. It was a false spring, a trick of the weather, but he let himself enjoy it. They spent the day outside, working together, the shared tasks feeling less like chores and more like the building of something new. "In Boston," she told him over lunch, "my days were spent in parlors, practicing watercolors and making polite conversation. I used to dream of having calluses on my hands, proof that I'd done something real." He looked at her hands, now reddened and scraped from their work. "Careful what you wish for." "All the best things hurt before they heal," she replied, and he knew she wasn't talking about blisters. Later, she found a patch of tiny blue wildflowers, forget-me-nots, that had survived the storm, blooming in a sheltered nook between two rocks. "How is this possible?" she whispered in awe. "Sometimes," he said, his voice quiet, "beauty finds a way, even in the harshest places." She picked a few, her touch gentle. "I want to press them," she said, looking up at him. "As a reminder." "Of what?" "Of this. Of finding something beautiful when I thought everything beautiful was lost." The words hung in the air between them. He felt the last of the ice around his heart crack and give way. For the first time since Sarah died, he let himself imagine a future that wasn't just about surviving. That night, they sat by the fire, closer than before. The false spring was already fading, the wind turning cold again. "The weather won't hold," he said. "I know," she replied softly, "but it was beautiful while it lasted." Yes, he thought, looking at her in the firelight. It was. He didn't know that their brief, beautiful peace was about to be shattered. The seventh morning, the sound came. The rhythmic crunch of horses walking through snow. Eli was awake instantly, his soldier's instincts screaming. It was more than one horse, moving with a purpose. He looked over at Clara. She was already sitting bolt upright, her face a mask of chalky white terror. She knew that sound. They had found her. "How many?" she whispered. He crept to the window. 3 men on horseback picking their way toward the cabin. They rode like professionals, like men who had tracked their quarry and were moving in for the kill. "3," he said. "Friends of yours?" "No," she breathed. "They're men my father hired. Pinkertons, I think." Pinkertons. The name was a legend in the West. Manhunters. Relentless. If her father had hired Pinkertons, this was more than a family squabble. Then a voice called out, sharp and clear in the cold air. "Miss Byron, we know you're in there. Come on out and no one gets hurt." Byron, not Reed. She had lied about her name. The first secret was out. "My father," she began, her hand going to a thin chain around her neck. "He's not just a wealthy man, Eli. He's connected to people who don't tolerate defiance." "What kind of connected?" Before she could answer, the voice came again. Miss Byron, your father's worried sick. It's time to come home. Clara stood up, her movements stiff. I have to go with them. If I don't, they'll what? She pulled the chain from her neck. On it was a heavy signet ring, a family crest. This ring, it represents a consortium, shipping, railways, mines. My marriage wasn't about love. It was a deal to consolidate power. Her voice dropped to a terrified whisper. An enterprise that doesn't tolerate loose ends? The implication hit him like a physical blow. They weren't here to take her home for tea. They were here to silence her. The man outside was getting impatient. We're not leaving without you, miss. Eli moved towards his rifle, his mind racing. 3 professional killers against 1 man in a log cabin. The odds were impossible. But then he looked at Clara, at the fear in her eyes, but also the defiance. No, he said, the word like a stone in the quiet room. He picked up the rifle, the weight of it familiar and reassuring. You came here for sanctuary. Sanctuary is what you'll get. If they want to take you, they'll have to go through me first. She stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief and something else. Hope. You don't understand what you're risking, she whispered. They're killers, Eli. But she was already moving, pulling a sheaf of papers from her hidden bundle. Official documents, deeds, contracts. My father's consortium, they're corrupt. They've been using their power to steal land, to ruin lives. People have died. She clutched the papers. I have the proof. That's why they sent them. Not to bring me home, to bring this back, and to make sure I never talk. Then he saw it. Through the window, one of the men had dismounted. He wasn't just watching the cabin. He was looking at the mountains, unrolling a map, using a surveyor's transit. They weren't just here for Clara. They were here for his valley. If I die out here, Clara said, her voice hollow with realization, it's a tragedy, but it's also a business opportunity. They can claim discovery rights on any land I explored before my unfortunate accident. It all clicked into place. Her death would solve 2 problems at once. They would erase the witness and seize the land, his sanctuary. The life he had built was about to be burned away for profit. His past had finally caught up with him, but it was wearing a stranger's face. The silence outside stretched, tight and deadly. The Pinkertons were moving into position. Eli could hear the faint jingle of spurs, the creak of saddle leather. They were professionals getting ready to do a job. How much ammunition do you have? He asked Clara, his voice all business now, the voice of the cavalryman he used to be. Enough, she said. And then she reached into her boot and pulled out a tiny silver-plated derringer. My grandmother taught me that a lady should always be prepared to defend her honor. He stared at the little pistol, then at her. How many more surprises are you carrying? Enough, she said, her gray eyes glinting like steel. The question is, will we survive long enough to use them? They would try to smoke them out, he knew, set fire to the cabin and pick them off as they ran. They want you alive if possible, he said, his voice grim, to find out who else knows about those papers. We don't have that problem. We just have to make it too expensive for them to win. He moved through the cabin, gathering what he could, a hunting knife, a hatchet, the heavy cast iron skillet. Clara watched him, her face pale but her hands steady. If something happens to me, he told her, looking her straight in the eye, use that little gun. Don't let them take you alive. She nodded. Eli, she said, her voice suddenly soft, if we don't make it, I want you to know, these past few days, it's the first time in my life I've felt free. The words hit him harder than a bullet. In the midst of this chaos, this woman had just handed him her heart. Clara. I know it's foolish, she whispered, but you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? Hope. Before he could answer, there was a splintering crash from the back of the cabin. They were starting. They were coming in. They're trying to burn us out, he said, his ear to the wall. We have minutes. He looked around the cabin, his home for 3 years, and felt a strange sense of detachment. It was just a place. The woman standing beside him, her little pistol held ready, she was what mattered now. She was worth fighting for. There's another way out, he said, a sudden, desperate plan forming. He strode to the center of the room and ripped up a floorboard. Beneath it was a dark, square hole. Root cellar. There's a tunnel. Built it my first winter, just in case. Then we run, she said. We run, he agreed, and we lead them into my country, on my terms. He looked at her one last time. But once we go down there, this life is over. She met his gaze without flinching. Some things, she said, are worth more than the safety of familiar walls. The root cellar was cramped and smelled of damp earth. Eli helped Clara down the rough-hewn ladder into the darkness. The tunnel comes out behind some boulders, about 50 yards from here, he whispered. There's a cache, food, ammunition. Not much, but enough. As they were about to enter the narrow passage, Clara stopped him. She reached into her dress and pulled out a simple, thin gold band. This was my grandmother's wedding ring, she said, pressing it into his hand. I want you to have it. Clara, I can't. It's not payment. It's a promise that we're going to build something together. If we survive this. Above them, they could hear the crackle of flames and the crash of the cabin being torn apart. Smoke was beginning to seep through the floorboards. He slipped the ring into his vest pocket, where it rested against his chest. A small, warm weight. That first night, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I thought I was just saving you from the storm. But you were saving me from myself. You brought me back to life, Clara. Then we survived this together, she whispered, her eyes shining in the dim light. And we built a life worth surviving for. They plunged into the tunnel, the sounds of their old lives burning away behind them. They were running not just from the Pinkertons, but from the ghosts that had haunted them both. They emerged into the cold afternoon air, free but hunted. The real fight had just begun. Behind them, his cabin was an inferno, a pillar of black smoke against the white snow. Let them think we burned with it, he said. It'll buy us time. He retrieved the cache, jerky, hardtack, and a precious box of cartridges. We head for the high country. There's an old mining camp. We can make a stand there. They moved quickly, climbing into the rugged terrain where horses couldn't follow. But the Pinkertons were good. A shout from the valley below told them the tunnel had been found. The hunt was on. They ran, a desperate, lung-burning scramble over rock and through deep snow. Clara kept pace, her city-bred softness burned away by pure, raw will. The first bullet whined past Eli's ear, clipping a chip of bark from a pine tree beside his head. He shoved Clara forward. Keep going. Get to the camp. I'm not leaving you. You're getting to cover so I can fight. Go. He dropped behind a fallen log, his rifle coming up smooth as thought. He wasn't a hermit anymore. He was a soldier. He fired not to kill, but to slow them down. His shot caught the lead man in the shoulder, sending him spinning into the snow. The others dove for cover. It bought them moments. He fell back, fired again, then scrambled after Clara. The mining camp was a ghost town of dilapidated buildings, a perfect place for an ambush. He found Clara in the main assay office, her derringer clutched in her hand. They're good, he panted, reloading. But this is my ground now. The assault came at dusk. The two remaining agents tried a coordinated rush, expecting to overwhelm them. But they were funneling themselves into a kill zone. Eli's rifle barked, its report echoing off the canyon walls. He saw one man go down, the other charge forward, firing wildly. A shot splintered the doorframe near Clara's head. She didn't flinch. She waited, and when the man was almost on top of them, her small derringer spat its single shot. The man staggered, looked down at the hole in his chest with surprise, and collapsed. Silence. The smell of gun smoke hung heavy in the freezing air. Is it over? Clara whispered. For now, Eli said, his eyes scanning the tree line. But they'll send more. We can't stay here. She looked out at the vast, unforgiving wilderness stretching to the horizon, then back at him. Where do we go? West, he said, the answer simple and absolute. We go west until we find a place where your father's money and his guns can't reach us. He reached out and took her hand. It was cold, but her grip was strong. A tired, fragile smile touched her lips. Together? Together, he said. And in that moment, standing in a blood-stained ghost town with their pasts in ashes behind them, their future was the only thing left. Spring came late to the Oregon Territory, but it came with a gentle promise the harsh Wyoming mountains had never offered. 6 months had passed. 6 months of looking over their shoulders, of moving through the wild spaces on the map until they finally found a place to stop running. They stood on the porch of a new cabin, one they'd built together in the fertile soil of the Willamette Valley. Clara was tending a small garden, her hands now calloused and capable, moving with a confident grace among the young bean sprouts. They had been married by a traveling preacher in a dusty Idaho town, swapping the simple gold bands Eli had forged himself. Her past was a distant storm cloud, her father's reach finally outrun by the sheer, stubborn vastness of the American West. "The beans are coming up," she called to him, her smile radiant. She walked over, her boots muddy, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "Any regrets?" she asked, the ritual question they had adopted. "None," he answered, pulling her close. "Only that it took a blizzard to bring you to my door." She leaned against him, warm and solid. "The path led me where I needed to be," she said softly. "It led me to you." The world they had built was quiet, safe, and their own. It was a life forged in fire and ice, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most beautiful things are born from the worst storms. If their story reminds you that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost, then make sure you're subscribed, because the courage to start over, to build a new life from the ashes, is a story we all need to hear. Together, Eli and Clara walked back to the garden, their hands clasped tight, ready to see what the future would grow.